3 days ago, American warships seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. President Trump called it the largest tanker ever captured. Venezuela called it piracy. Russia demanded an explanation. And suddenly, the Caribbean feels like the most dangerous place on Earth. But here's what nobody is telling you. This exact scenario already happened. Same country, same accusations, same warships in the Caribbean, same world powers circling Venezuela like sharks around wounded prey. The year was 1902, and what happened next almost started a world war. Most people have never heard this story. It's been erased from American textbooks, hidden from European history classes, buried so deep that even historians forget it happened. But if you want to understand what's really happening in Venezuela right now, you need to understand what happened 123 years ago. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it absolutely rhymes. This is the story of how 3 European empires invaded South America, how one American president stopped them with a single threat, and how this forgotten crisis created the world order we're still living in today. It begins with a dictator, a mountain of debt, and a decision that would bring the world's most powerful navies to Venezuela's doorstep. In 1899, a man named Cipriano Castro marched out of the Andes Mountains with 60 soldiers, just 60 men. 3 months later, he controlled all of Venezuela. They called him the Lion of the Andes. The American Secretary of State called him something else, a crazy brute, probably the worst of Venezuela's many dictators. And Venezuela had seen plenty of dictators. Castro had spent 7 years in exile, hiding in Colombia, running illegal cattle operations, and building a private army. When Venezuela's government collapsed into chaos, he saw his opportunity. He marched his tiny force across the border and somehow, impossibly, fought his way to the capital. But conquering Venezuela was the easy part. Running it was something else entirely. Castro inherited a country that had been torn apart by civil war. The economy was shattered, the treasury was empty, and Venezuela owed money to everyone. British banks, German investors, Italian merchants, French companies. They had all poured money into Venezuela during the good years, building railways, financing coffee plantations, extending loans to previous governments. Now they wanted their money back. But Castro had a problem. He didn't have any money. Venezuela's coffee exports had collapsed. The civil wars had destroyed the tax system. The customs revenues that should have paid the debts were barely enough to keep his army fed. So Castro did what desperate leaders often do. He ignored the problem. When British diplomats came to discuss repayment, Castro refused to meet them. Between February and June of 1902, British representatives sent 17 formal notes to the Venezuelan government. Castro didn't respond to a single one. When German investors demanded compensation for factories destroyed in the Civil War, Castro told them to file their claims in Venezuelan courts. Courts that he controlled. Courts that ruled in Venezuela's favor every single time. When foreign companies complained, Castro's supporters conveniently rioted in the streets, looting their businesses and warehouses. The message was clear. Venezuela's debts were Venezuela's problem. If Europe didn't like it, Europe could go to hell. In London and Berlin, patience was running out. The British Empire in 1902 was still the most powerful force on Earth. The sun never set on British territory. The Royal Navy controlled every ocean. When Britain demanded payment, nations paid, but Venezuela wasn't paying. Germany in 1902 was a rising power with something to prove. Kaiser Wilhelm II was building a navy to rival Britain's, expanding German influence across the globe, hungry for respect and recognition. And Germany had significant investments in Venezuela. German merchants dominated Venezuelan trade. German bankers had financed Venezuelan railways. German citizens had been caught in the crossfire of Venezuelan civil wars. The Kaiser wanted his money. More importantly, the Kaiser wanted the world to see that Germany could project power anywhere on Earth. In mid-1901, German Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow made a decision. Germany would use military force to collect what Venezuela owed. The German Navy began planning a blockade, but Germany couldn't act alone. Moving against a country in the Western Hemisphere meant dealing with the United States and its Monroe Doctrine, that 70-year-old promise that America would not tolerate European colonization or interference in the Americas. So Germany approached Britain. What if they acted together? What if the 2 most powerful navies in the world combined forces? What if they presented their demands backed by overwhelming firepower? Surely even the crazy brute in Caracas would have to listen then. Britain was initially hesitant. The British government valued its relationship with the United States. They had no desire to antagonize Washington. But Castro's continued silence was becoming an embarrassment. British investors were demanding action. The British press was asking why the mighty Royal Navy couldn't collect a simple debt. In August 1902, Britain and Germany reached an agreement. They would blockade Venezuela together. They would seize Venezuelan ships. They would capture Venezuelan ports if necessary. They would force Castro to negotiate. But they would not, under any circumstances, take Venezuelan territory permanently. This distinction was crucial, because the American position on European intervention had been stated clearly just months before. In December 1901, Theodore Roosevelt, the new American president, addressed Congress on the subject of European powers in South American nations. If any South American country misbehaves toward any European country, Roosevelt declared, let the European country spank it. This was not a metaphor. Roosevelt genuinely believed that some nations deserved to be disciplined, that countries who refused to pay their debts invited consequences, that international law meant nothing without enforcement. Roosevelt was no anti-imperialist. Just 3 years earlier, he had charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba, helping the United States seize Spain's colonial empire. He believed in power. He believed in strength. He believed that great nations had the right, perhaps even the duty, to shape the world order. But Roosevelt also believed in the Monroe Doctrine, and therein lay the contradiction that would soon bring the world to the brink of war. If European powers were allowed to spank misbehaving South American countries, where did the spanking end? What stopped a temporary blockade from becoming a permanent occupation? What stopped debt collection from becoming colonization? In November 1902, these questions were about to get very real. The German and British governments formally notified Washington of their intentions. They were going to blockade Venezuela. They were going to seize Venezuelan ships. They were going to force Castro to negotiate. But they promised they wouldn't take any territory. Roosevelt accepted their assurances. The blockade was scheduled to begin in December, but something was happening that November that the European powers didn't fully understand. In the harbors of Puerto Rico, American warships were gathering. The official explanation was routine, winter exercises, training maneuvers, nothing to do with Venezuela. But the man commanding those ships was no ordinary admiral. George Dewey had become a national hero 4 years earlier when he destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. He was the only four-star admiral in the United States Navy. He was the most famous military commander in America, and he hated the Germans. During the Battle of Manila Bay, German warships had hovered nearby, watching, waiting, perhaps hoping to grab some piece of the Philippines if the Americans failed. Dewey had confronted them personally. The near confrontation had made headlines around the world. Now Dewey was sailing toward the Caribbean with the most powerful American fleet ever assembled. Coincidence? Theodore Roosevelt didn't believe in coincidences. On November 24, 1902, Roosevelt hosted a private dinner at the White House. The guest list was interesting. Baron Speck von Sternberg, a German diplomat with direct access to the Kaiser. Admiral George Dewey, the hero of Manila Bay. The two men sat next to each other all evening. Roosevelt wanted to send a message. The next day, Germany and Britain announced their blockade. On December 7, 1902, British and German diplomats delivered ultimatums to Cipriano Castro. Pay your debts immediately. Submit to international arbitration. Accept responsibility for damages to European citizens. Castro had 48 hours to respond. He responded by doing nothing at all. On December 9th, the blockade began. British and German warships took up positions along the Venezuelan coast. Within hours, they had seized 4 Venezuelan gunboats. The tiny Venezuelan navy essentially ceased to exist. 3 of those captured ships were destroyed by the Germans, sunk without warning. Their crews barely escaped. Castro panicked. The Lion of the Andes had been so confident that the United States would protect him. The Monroe Doctrine would save him. America would never allow European warships to attack a nation in the Western Hemisphere. But American warships had not appeared. American protests had not been filed. America seemed to be allowing this to happen. On December 11th, Italy joined the blockade. Now 3 European powers surrounded Venezuela. On December 13th, British and German warships bombarded Fort San Carlos, the fortress guarding the entrance to Lake Maracaibo. Shells rained down on Venezuelan positions. Soldiers died. Buildings burned. And still, America did nothing, or so it seemed. Because while Europe was attacking Venezuela, Theodore Roosevelt was conducting a very different kind of war. A war of messages, a war of threats, a war that would remain secret for 14 years, and a war that would change the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere forever. What Roosevelt did next would force the mightiest empires on earth to back down. It would create a new doctrine that would govern American foreign policy for a century. And it would set the stage for a confrontation that is still playing out today, in the same waters, over the same country, with the same stakes. The Kaiser thought Roosevelt was bluffing. He was wrong. On December 8, 1902, one day before the blockade began, Theodore Roosevelt summoned the German ambassador to the White House. Theodor von Holleben was a career diplomat, experienced and cautious. He had warned Berlin for months that Roosevelt was more dangerous than he appeared, that the Americans were serious about the Monroe Doctrine, that pushing too hard on Venezuela could backfire catastrophically. Berlin had ignored him. The Kaiser believed Roosevelt was bluffing. America had a small army, a modest navy, no real experience in great power confrontation. Germany had the second most powerful fleet in the world and the most formidable army in history. What was Roosevelt going to do about it? Von Holleben was about to find out. In the White House meeting, Roosevelt was polite but direct. Germany must agree to international arbitration for the Venezuelan debt dispute, no occupation of Venezuelan territory, no permanent presence in the Western Hemisphere. Von Holleben explained that his imperial master would never agree to arbitration. Germany's honor was at stake. The debts must be paid on German terms. Roosevelt nodded thoughtfully. Then he delivered his ultimatum. Germany would accept arbitration within 10 days. If satisfactory assurances did not come from Berlin, Admiral Dewey would be ordered to sail to Venezuela. The American fleet would ensure that no Venezuelan territory was seized by German forces, not by threat, by action. Von Holleben was stunned. This was not a diplomatic request. This was a declaration that the United States was prepared to go to war with Germany over Venezuela. The ambassador protested. Surely the president did not mean this. Surely this was negotiating posture. Roosevelt smiled. He meant every word. But von Holleben had a problem. He didn't believe Roosevelt was serious. He thought this was American bluster. If he transmitted this ultimatum to Berlin, the Kaiser would be furious. It would look like von Holleben had failed to manage the Americans properly. So the ambassador made a catastrophic decision. He didn't tell Berlin about the ultimatum. He kept it to himself, convinced that Roosevelt would back down when the blockade began. When Germany demonstrated its seriousness, the blockade began on December 9th. The gunboats were seized, the bombardments started, and Roosevelt did not back down. On December 14th, 6 days after the original ultimatum, Roosevelt met with von Holleben again. The president asked a simple question. What was the Kaiser's response? Von Holleben froze. There was no response, because there had been no message sent. Roosevelt's expression changed. Very well, the president said. It would no longer be necessary to wait the remaining days of the ultimatum. Admiral Dewey would be ordered to sail 24 hours earlier than planned, and then Roosevelt added something that terrified the ambassador. Not a word of this conversation would be committed to paper. There would be no diplomatic record, no formal declaration. If Germany accepted arbitration, Roosevelt would publicly praise the Kaiser for his wisdom and statesmanship. If Germany refused, the American fleet would appear without warning. Von Holleben was now in an impossible position. He had concealed an American ultimatum from his own government. War was potentially hours away, and he would bear personal responsibility for the disaster. That night, December 14, 1902, von Holleben sent the most urgent communication of his diplomatic career to Berlin. The Americans were not bluffing. Roosevelt was prepared for war. Dewey's fleet was ready to sail. Germany had hours to decide. The message crossed the Atlantic through the night. In Berlin, the Kaiser and his advisors faced an impossible choice. German honor demanded that they stand firm. Germany could not be seen backing down to American threats. The prestige of the empire was at stake. But German strategy demanded caution. The German Navy, for all its power, was concentrated in European waters. The American fleet was already in the Caribbean, positioned to strike. Any naval engagement would happen thousands of miles from German bases, with German ships cut off from resupply and reinforcement. And Britain, Germany's supposed ally in this venture, was already looking for a way out. The British government had never been comfortable with this operation. The press reaction in Britain had been hostile. The alliance with Germany on Venezuelan debt collection was unpopular. Any excuse to extract Britain from this mess would be welcome. If Germany provoked a war with America, Britain would not support them. Germany would face the United States alone. The Kaiser made his decision. On December 17, 1902, less than 24 hours after Roosevelt's final ultimatum, von Holleben appeared at the White House. His face was, according to one account, wreathed in smiles. On behalf of his imperial master, the ambassador had the honor to request that the President of the United States serve as arbitrator between Germany and Venezuela. Roosevelt graciously accepted. He then publicly praised Kaiser Wilhelm for his commitment to peaceful resolution and international law. The Kaiser had blinked. The crisis was over. But its consequences had only begun. For the next 2 months, negotiations continued. In February 1903, an agreement was reached. Venezuela would pay its debts over time, with 30% of its customs revenues reserved for foreign creditors. The blockade was lifted. The warships sailed home. But the real settlement was not about Venezuela at all. It was about power. Theodore Roosevelt had demonstrated that the United States would use military force to prevent European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Not just colonization, not just territorial acquisition, any intervention that America considered threatening. This was something new. 2 years later, Roosevelt formally articulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. If Latin American nations could not maintain order, if they could not pay their debts, if they could not prevent circumstances that might invite European intervention, then America would intervene first. America would discipline the misbehaving nations, so Europe wouldn't have to. Some historians call this the birth of American empire in Latin America. Others call it the foundation of hemispheric security. Either way, it changed everything. For the next century, the United States would intervene in Latin American nations dozens of times. Military occupations, supported coups, economic pressure, all justified by the principle Roosevelt established in 1902. The Western Hemisphere belonged to America. And Venezuela? Venezuela has been at the center of great power competition ever since. In the 1940s, Venezuela became the world's largest oil exporter. Suddenly, the stakes of Venezuelan stability weren't about debt payments. They were about the fuel that powered the global economy. In 2019, when opposition leader Juan Guaido challenged President Maduro, the United States backed Guaido while Russia and China backed Maduro. Different century, same pattern. Outside powers competing for influence in Venezuela. And now, in December 2025, American warships are in the Caribbean again. The USS Gerald Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, sits just miles from Venezuelan waters. It's the largest military buildup in the region since the Cuban Missile Crisis. American strikes have hit over 20 vessels in Caribbean waters since September. The official explanation is drug interdiction. Venezuela calls it preparation for invasion. 3 days ago, American forces seized an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. The largest tanker ever seized, according to President Trump. Venezuela called it piracy. Russia demanded answers. The echoes of 1902 are impossible to ignore. Then, European powers blockaded Venezuela over debt and seized Venezuelan ships. Now, America blockades Venezuelan oil exports and seizes Venezuelan tankers. Then, a strongman dictator in Caracas defied the great powers, confident they wouldn't dare attack. Now Maduro defies American sanctions, confident that Russia and China will protect him. Then, Theodore Roosevelt gathered his fleet in Puerto Rico while publicly claiming it was just for exercises. Now, the Gerald Ford Carrier Group conducts operations in the Caribbean while Washington claims it's about drug interdiction. The question that hung over the Caribbean in 1902 is the same question hanging over it today. How far will the great powers go? In 1902, war was avoided because Germany backed down, because Roosevelt was willing to risk everything, because the Kaiser decided that Venezuelan debt was not worth fighting America over. But in 2025, the stakes are different. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. Russia has military advisors in Venezuela. Russian ships visit Venezuelan ports. Russian weapons arm Venezuelan forces. China buys most of Venezuela's oil exports. Chinese investment keeps Maduro's government afloat. If American pressure forces Maduro from power, Russia and China lose a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. They lose access to Venezuelan oil. They lose proof that American power can be resisted. If Maduro survives, the Monroe Doctrine, that 200-year-old promise that the Americas belong to America, becomes a dead letter. The Roosevelt Corollary, born in the crisis of 1902, faces its greatest test since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the man making decisions in Washington right now is doing so in the Roosevelt room. History doesn't repeat itself. But in the Caribbean, off the coast of Venezuela, history is rhyming in ways that should terrify us all. 123 years ago, the world came to the brink of war over Venezuelan debt. Today, the world stands at the brink again. The only question is whether this time someone blinks. Verdicta. The Venezuelan crisis of 1902 is one of the most consequential events in American history that nobody remembers. It established the precedent that the United States would use military force to exclude outside powers from the Western Hemisphere. It created the Roosevelt Corollary that justified a century of American intervention in Latin America. And it demonstrated that even the mightiest empires will retreat when confronted with credible American power. But the crisis also revealed something troubling. Great power competition over small countries rarely ends well for the small countries. Venezuela in 1902 was caught between European creditors and American ambitions. It had no real say in how the crisis was resolved. Its sovereignty was bargained away by powers that considered Venezuelan interests irrelevant. Venezuela in 2025 is caught between American pressure and Russian-Chinese support. It has no real say in how this confrontation will end. Its people suffer regardless of which great power prevails. The technology changes, the weapons improve, the rhetoric evolves, but the pattern remains the same. The great powers circle, and Venezuela pays the price.